Good evening and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Dr. Brian Henning and I'm Professor of Philosophy and Environmental Studies at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, where I'm the founder and director of the Gonzaga Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment. Just a quick bit about the Zoom webinar platform we're using this evening. First, note that closed captioning has been enabled. You can turn the feature on or off at the bottom of your Zoom window as you prefer. As this is a Zoom webinar, you may notice the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Questions that you pose there go to the moderators. And if we have time, we may indeed take a question from the audience and pose it to the speakers. So please do feel free as you're listening and as you're inclined to use that feature, the Q&A feature at the bottom, to pose any questions that you might have. Remember, it will only come to me and to the other panelists and will not be displayed for everyone assembled. At the present, the chat feature, which you can choose to turn on if you like, is enabled, and you're free to make use of it to make comments during the presentation tonight. However, should the chat become disruptive, we will disable it. Finally, please make sure that if you have any questions that you want to pose to the panelists, that you put that in the Q&A. The event tonight is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel within the next day or two. You can find a link to the channel by going to the events portion of our website at gonzaga.edu/climate center. Informed by an abiding commitment to a just society and care for the planet, the Gonzaga Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment serves our university community and the broader inland Northwest by promoting innovative interdisciplinary scholarship, teaching, consulting, and capacity building on the climate, society, and the environment. And we're very happy to be hosting this event as an example of that mission. Before introducing our speakers, and in the spirit of the Jesuit practice of composition of place, I would like to acknowledge that Gonzaga University resides on the homelands of the Spokane tribal people. This land holds the cultural DNA and the spirit of the first peoples of this place, the people of the river. It is their ancestors who are here, bring forth the power of this place, the knowledge that comes from the land. We're grateful to be on this land and ask for its support as we work to manifest our intentions during this gathering of hearts, minds, and spirits. If you're joining us from somewhere else in the world and you would like to acknowledge the Indigenous people who cared for the land on which you reside, please feel free to share that in the chat. So we are here tonight to talk about nature, ecosystems, natural communities, the earth itself, as having legally enforceable rights, or not. The first set of legal provisions recognizing the rights of nature in the world was drafted by one of our debaters tonight in the small community of Tamaqua Borough in Pennsylvania. These approaches tend to have three components. First, the recognition of the legal rights of a waterway or other ecosystem. Second, legal standing for a person or community to represent those rights in court. And third, the ability of a court to require restoration of an ecosystem back to its pre-damaged state. Since the passage of this ordinance, the concept of legally enforceable rights of nature has been embedded in the Ecuadorian Constitution, been adopted by over 36 cities and counties in the United States, including the city of Pittsburgh and Orange County, Florida, and has been the subject of rulings by courts in Ecuador, India, Colombia, and Bangladesh protecting certain ecosystems. Recently, 2 enforcement lawsuits, the first in the United States, were filed on the White Earth Chippewa Reservation in Minnesota and in Florida courts, both to enforce rights of nature laws. Proponents of the rights of nature argue that environmental regulatory system, which treats nature as merely property to be owned, has failed to protect nature and our own life support systems, and that a radical change in the law is needed, which repositions humanity in the role of a guardian or trustee of the best interests of those natural systems. Opponents of this approach see recognizing the rights of nature as inappropriate and ultimately demeaning to the special dignity of the human person, undermining a rights-based system of law which makes humans exceptional. They argue that we can protect the environment without giving nature rights, and that personal liberty and progress are dependent upon economic growth, which isn't possible without the use of natural resources. They argue that rights of nature laws are just another way of limiting property rights and putting important resources off limit to human use and development. Tonight, the leading proponent and opponent come together to debate this important issue: the rights of nature, saving the planet, or harmful to humanity. A little bit about our format. We've agreed to start with an opening statement from each of our debaters, and then each will have 3 minutes to respond to one of my questions, followed by a response and a reply of 2 and 1 minutes respectively. So that's 3 minutes to answer a question, followed by 2-minute reply and a 1-minute rebuttal. Then we'll move on to the next question, and we'll fit in as many as we have time for. Finally, each of the debaters will be able to make a closing statement. I'm going to do my best to keep track of time. And when a speaker has 20 seconds remaining, I'm going to give them a little green sheet of paper to flag that, and I'll give them a red sheet of paper when their time is up. Our goal, of course, is to have a respectful and informative dialogue where both speakers are given a fair opportunity to express their views. Finally, a reminder that we're taping the event tonight, and it'll be available on our website in the next couple of days. And now let's introduce our debaters. Thomas Linzey is an attorney and senior legal counsel for the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights, or CEDAR. He is widely recognized as the founder of the contemporary community rights and rights of nature movements, which have resulted in the adoption of several hundred municipal laws across the United States. Linzey's work has been featured in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Mother Jones, and The Nation magazine, and he was named in 2007 as one of Forbes magazine's top 10 revolutionaries. In 2018, Linzey was named by American environmental leaders as one of the top 400 environmentalists of the last 200 years. He's the author of several books and has been featured in Leonardo DiCaprio and True Media's films 11th Hour and We the People. Please join me virtually in welcoming Thomas Linzey. Our second debater this evening is Wesley J. Smith, who's an attorney and serves as chair and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute's Center on Human Exceptionalism. Since 1985, he has published thousands of articles, columns, and opinion pieces on issues pertaining to the moral importance of human life, addressing the entire spectrum of bioethical issues relating to conscience, patient protection, eugenics, suicide, transhumanism, medical ethics, and law and policy. His writing has appeared in Newsweek, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and Forbes, among others. And he has appeared on more than 1,000 television and radio talk interview programs, including ABC Nightline, Good Morning America, Larry King Live, CNN, Anderson Cooper 360, CNN World Report. He's testified as an expert witness in front of federal and state legislative committees, and he's an international lecturer and public speaker. We're very happy to have you with us. Welcome, Wesley Smith. I'll turn it now over to them for a short opening statement for tonight, starting with Wesley. As a reminder, I will hold up a green sheet when you have 20 seconds remaining and a red sheet when your time is up. Feel free, Wesley, to start your opening comments.
Thank you very much. I feel like saying, Thomas, we meet at last. I want to thank the Center for Climate, Society, and Environment and you, Dr. Henning, for arranging this. And Thomas Linzey, this was his idea. And he worked it, and it's come together, and I really appreciate you doing that, and I look forward to our exchange. Also, I thank the audience for caring about environmental issues and the crucial questions that impact the value and meaning of human life. I'm here tonight because I believe that the nature rights movement is a primary threat to human thriving, our prosperity, and a challenge to our self-concept as a species and the purpose and essential meaning of rights. The movement's greatest strength, in my view, is not its ideas, which I hope to show are quite destructive, but that too many people don't take them seriously and don't fully understand what the movement means to accomplish. And in that complacency comes the danger that nature rights will succeed. I should also say that I do not oppose nature rights because I oppose environmental laws, but because I believe good environmentalism is very important to our well-being and in keeping with our human duties to leave the world a better place than we found it. But good environmental practice requires prosperity, and prosperity requires our ability to thrive off the earth, mine minerals, cut timber, farm huge tracts of land, and otherwise live off of Earth's bounty, mediated, of course, by regulations to maintain a properly clean and healthy environment and protect ecosystems. Thus, if you take a look around the world, the countries that have the best environmental circumstances tend to be free and wealthy. And if you don't think that's true, just compare China with the United States. So what are the putative rights of nature? Here is how they are defined in the Constitution of Ecuador. Quote, nature or Pachamama, which is the goddess earth, where life is reproduced and exists, has the right to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its vital cycles, structure, functions, and its processes and evolution. Think about how all-encompassing that is. It's akin to a right to life that is very close to a right not to be interfered with or exploited in any significant way. In fact, such a rights for nature would stop most development in its tracks, which of course is the point. Due to time, I'm only going to quickly list some of the problems I have with the nature rights approach, and I'll try to go quickly here. There is no limiting principle. Everything that exists in the cosmos is part of nature. Pond scum, pollywogs, stink bugs, grass, poison ivy, pigeons, flora and fauna, and indeed geological features. In fact, the greatest success I think that the nature rights movement has had so far is in granting rights to things such as rivers like the Amazon and to glaciers. Nature rights destroys nuance in public policy. There's always a dynamic tension between creating prosperity and human freedom and protecting the environment. Good environmental policy recognizes that and strives to create targeted policies that sometimes put greater emphasis on human thriving, and at other times, as with the Endangered Species Act, restricts enterprise. It unleashes vigilante justice. Nature rights are enforced by any private person who believes that a project or enterprise interferes with the right of nature to exist and persist. Where else have we seen that approach? Oh, right, Texas, which is allowing civil litigation to stop abortion. Well, why do you think they came up with that idea? Because it came from the nature rights movement. This was the genius, frankly, of Thomas. And now social conservatives have said, hey, that's a pretty good idea. And if we go along this route, we're going to end up with vigilante justice on a whole array of issues. And I don't think that will be healthy for society. It is utopian. It deems the ends to be so noble that the means, I think, will leave us with a much poorer society and a less free society. And practically speaking, nature rights would make it impossible to obtain liability insurance, which would bring enterprise to a screeching halt. It would also create a great green mail industry for lawyers, and we're both lawyers, so we know how they think. And they could say, hey, nice project you got going. It would be terrible if nature sued you to stop it, wouldn't it? And then you get a settlement. I'm going to stop here. One more point. There's no grandfather clauses. If these laws go into effect, they could impact existing structures and developments. So I'll stop. I look forward to our exchange and thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Wesley, for that opening statement. We'll turn it now over to Thomas. You have 5 minutes.
Great. Hello, and thanks for everyone for joining us this evening. I just wanted to echo Wesley's thank you to the Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment for hosting this event tonight. Also to Dr. Henning for moderating it, and Wesley for participating tonight. So what are we talking about tonight? Well, we're talking about civil rights type protections for nature. Kind of bends our brains sometimes because we think about civil rights as belonging only to humans, but we're talking about civil rights type protections for nature. And I don't think we would be in this place except for 2 things. We wouldn't be talking about this tonight except for 2 things. One is that we're in a crisis moment from an environmental perspective. And secondly, is that we have a current environmental law system that's inadequate or unable to actually confront that crisis moment. I don't think we need to be reminded of statistics here tonight, but just to run through some numbers. The crisis moment has arrived at our doorstep because there's only 3% of original plant and animal habitat left in the globe. We've managed to clear out 97% of it. 90% of original forests have been logged. Half of all plant and animal species have been driven to extinction. 80,000 industrial chemicals are now in use in the world, with 700 found within every individual human body. In the US alone, 40% of all waterways don't even meet the minimum clean water standards that we've set with clean water laws in the United States. And finally, climate change, the elephant in the room. has made the most pessimistic projections of climate scientists look downright optimistic at this point. So we're in a crisis moment. And we have an environmental law system that's incapable of dealing with that crisis moment. And the bedrock of our environmental law system is basically Western law, which pays this homage to property rights and builds everything around those property rights. Under the system, nature is property or a thing that can be owned. And under our system of law, because it's property, the more you own, the more you can destroy. The more nature you own, the more that you can destroy. And we need to contrast that concept with indigenous communities, like the Chippewa, who talk about salmon and birds as the flying people, the swimming people, and the singing people. Or the Yurok Nation in Northern California talks about the Klamath River as being a relative or a living being. So nature is animated, not something that can be owned, but something animated and connected to people and communities. And I think Sir Francis Bacon, who may have been the most extreme of human exceptionalists that we've seen in history, used to say quite frequently that one of the things necessary for Western civilization was to torture nature on a rack to extract her secrets. So I don't think we can draw any more distinction between the indigenous way of looking at nature and a Western society's way of looking at nature. And unfortunately, that Western society way of looking at nature comes with actual legal protections for property that overcome certain statutory or regulatory protections for nature. So we have a source code basically in which property rights overcomes, because they're constitutionally based, overcomes those regulatory or statutory protections that we try to provide for nature. So rights of nature is a response to that failure. It's a practical response to that failure. And it was my privilege back in 2006 to work and draft the first rights of nature law that was written and passed in the globe. And in that situation, that community passed it because toxic waste was coming into their community and they couldn't find a way through the conventional environmental law system to stop it. It was also my privilege in 2008 to travel to Ecuador to assist the Ecuadorian Constitutional Assembly with writing a new constitution that was intended to protect biodiversity and protect against extractive industries, because there was no other option other than to move to that new rights-based system of environmental law. In 2010, the city of Pittsburgh passed a rights of nature law to protect the 3 rivers that flow through the city of Pittsburgh from fracking, hydrofracking for natural gas. 6 tribal governments in the United States have now passed rights of nature to deal with everything from protection of wild rice as a cultural staple to fracking, protection of salmon. High courts in Colombia, India, and Bangladesh have recognized rights of nature principles and jurisprudence to protecting Amazon and the Ganges River. The largest municipality in the United States just passed a rights of nature law at the end of 2020, county of 1.5 million people, to protect 2 rivers, the Wekiva River and the Econ-Lakahatchee River, because existing environmental laws were not sufficient to protect them. And in February of this year, the first Canadian municipality passed a rights of nature law to protect the Magpie River near Quebec. So we have to understand that this rights of nature concept is not an academic or feel-good idea. It actually grows out of real needs. It's a practical solution. And I think, as some courts have said, it's an emerging norm of international environmental law. And the question I would leave you with is that it's no longer can nature have rights under the system of law. It's the challenge is to craft these laws to make sure they give us the tools that we need to protect the environment and ourselves.
All right, we've got our dinner set here. That's a good start. Thank you very much for those opening statements. Now to the question and answer. So we've got this format. I will pose a question and the person to whom it's posed will have 3 minutes to formulate an answer. And then there'll be up to 2 minutes for a reply from the other debater. And then finally 1 minute for a rebuttal. As we agreed, the first question goes to you, Thomas. The question is, do we need a new legal system to protect the natural environment? If yes, why? If no, why not? You have 3 minutes.
Yes, and the answer is, of course, at least from our vantage point, absolutely. So, for 10 years, I tried to enforce traditional environmental laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And there's a reason why those environmental laws don't work today. Number one, the regulations that implement those laws are essentially written by the very corporations or industry that ostensibly those regulations are supposed to regulate. We have corporate capture, which means people move between regulatory agencies and corporations all the time. It's tax deductible for corporations to defend permit appeals, but the cost for appealing permits actually rests on communities as a burden. And we have a culture that thinks that endless economic growth is possible, and a legal system that actually enforces that by putting property rights over these types of rights recognitions for nature. And I think there are two current cases that exemplify why we need a change in the law. And one is this indigenous-led fight against the tar sands oil pipeline known as Enbridge Line 3, which is this huge project to bring tar sands oil from Alberta to Wisconsin. And the White Earth Chippewa people, the Anishinaabe, have been working to stop that project, but can't stop it through existing environmental permits through those frameworks. And so in 2018, they passed a law recognizing the rights of wild rice, a cultural staple for the Chippewa. And now they're suing in tribal court to try to stop the project on the basis of those protections for wild rice. And the second pending case that I think is on point is Orange County, Florida, where this Orange County law passed last year. There's now a proposal in the county for a 1,900 acre development that's going to dredge and fill acres of wetlands for the project. Using the recently adopted Orange County law, folks in Florida have sued and are suing to stop that project based on the rights of wetlands. And again, no recourse for those people to stop the development of wetlands through the existing regulatory environmental structure. So they had to turn to new structures, and that's why I think it's practical. We need a law in the environment, a change in law similar to that sought by the abolitionists in the 1860s and the suffragists from 1800s on, which is to convert those things that are treated as property under our system of law, like slaves, African Americans, women, and actually transform them into being rights-bearing entities. I think the same kind of movement is necessary in the environmental law field. And it's really not that radical a shift in the law. You know, Wesley and I have sparred over this in the past, but it's not that radical a departure. Corporations are recognized as having rights under US law. Ships actually sue each other under maritime law in the United States, and ships are given rights to do that. Guardians ad litem are given to children. So counsel to represent the best interests of the children. And across the US, whether it's Minnesota or Pennsylvania, we have these sections in our existing state constitutions that allow private causes of action by individuals to protect natural resources and to try to stop pollution. So the shift that's needed here is not just for the tree huggers. It's not just to protect wild places. It's also to protect life support systems. And I think in that way, those practical needs really lead to a pro-human approach, which is what rights of nature is. Human life support systems is what we're talking about as well.
Thank you, Thomas. Wesley, you have up to 2 minutes for a reply.
Sure. I want us to consider the chaos that would emerge if we had extensive rights of nature laws, and anyone who wanted to stop a project could go to court. Let me give you an example. You know, the windmills that generate electricity and renewable electricity kill millions of birds. Well, I can certainly see someone going into court who loves birds and says this interferes with the freedom of birds and the rights of birds to be able to fly freely and catch their prey and so forth and so on. And I don't see any limiting principle that would stop us. It also interferes with democratic processes. When you decide you're going to take these issues that do require give and take out of democratic processes into judges, which I think is ridiculous. Plus, who's going to represent nature, Thomas or me? Who said Thomas thinks he will? But let me tell you something, there are going to be a lot of people, if these things go through, who say, no, Thomas shouldn't do it. It should be me, and somebody else might get involved. I also think we have to look at the exact wording in these cases. And let's take a look at that Florida situation where there is a petition circulating to create a constitutional right to free waters for water. And it's because the state of Florida preempted that Orange County ordinance that went in and banned it, which I supported. And here's what the proposal says, and it lists a bunch of rivers, the Appalachia, Biscayne Bay, etc., rivers and bays. And then it says, Florida waters have a right to clean water, and that right shall include the right of those waters to exist, flow, be free from pollution, and maintain a healthy ecosystem. Also, they define I'm out of time. They define the term water very loosely, including all rivers, lakes, streams, springs, impoundments, wetlands, and so forth. There would be no way to have any limiting principle on the water suing in Florida if this proposal went through.
Thank you, Wesley. Thomas, up to 1 minute for a final rebuttal before we move on.
Yeah, I would say if humans are so exceptional, surely we can design wind turbines that don't kill birds. You know, that's part of it. In addition, environmental permits, there's nothing democratic about them now, which is that the regulations under which they're issued are drafted by a relatively small group of people in given large industries to actually control the issuance of those permits. And they give very little control, zero, because if you're writing the regulations, why would you give control to anybody else? For communities on the ground to actually say no to projects that have been permitted by the state or federal government. And I'm reminded, who just did some research into the suffragist movement and read the headlines in the newspapers when suffrage was being talked about, the constitutional amendment being adopted in the US Constitution, about all the chaos that would erupt if women were given the right to vote. And people ran screaming, white men ran screaming through the streets saying what kind of chaos would erupt if women had the suffrage at the federal level across the United States. And so anyway, with those and the Florida laws exist, flourish, be free of pollution, I think we all probably could buy into some of those principles about right to life for a river, for example, but that's the Florida law.
I suspect
I
we'll
would
be able
point
to
out
get
that
back.
it was white men who voted for women's suffrage, but that's okay.
I suspect we'll be able to come back to these as we move forward, and hopefully they'll layer on top of each other rather than short circuiting. That's my hope, at least. So with optimism, I'm going to propose a second question. This goes to you first, Wesley. You'll have 3 minutes to answer. Do rights of nature laws affect human rights? And is that harmful to the protection of those human rights?
Yeah, thank you. And certainly they do. You know, rights generally stated are moral entitlements embodied in law to protect the lives and liberty of all people. Rights are not earned. They come with a package of being a member of the human race. This principle was most eloquently and succinctly enunciated in the Declaration of Independence and its assertion of the self-evident truth that all men, and we should say women, are created equal, and therefore each are endowed with inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For hundreds of years, implementing Jefferson's timeless assertion of the unique importance of human life and freedom into universal acceptance has been the noble goal of Western civilization. And of course, we haven't completed it yet. Toward this end, invidious bigotry has been repeatedly and courageously assailed, and one by one, religious persecution, slavery, Jim Crow, exclusive male suffrage, etc., have either collapsed or been materially weakened on their way toward hope for an ultimate extinction. But under nature rights beliefs, essentially everything would have rights. That would dilute the concept of rights as a principle in the same way that wild inflation does to currency. It would also lead to the ridiculous concept that we would have duties to honor the rights of nature, but nothing in nature would be any obligations to us, because of course, the whole idea is nonsensical because they can't. Moreover, nature's claims would only be enforced by other human beings acting on nature's behalf, since nature could have no idea of what was going on. It's enough to make one dizzy. To illustrate this, let's get back to this Florida water rights proposal, which states, the rights secured in this section shall not be interpreted to confer liabilities, duties, obligations, or responsibilities on waters. In other words, the water could sue you to prevent a flood control project because it has a right to flow freely, but you couldn't sue the water after a flood destroyed your home, which of course would be ridiculous to even consider. That illustrates the ridiculousness, in my view, of this whole concept of rights for nature. Now, that doesn't mean, oh, we just let water be filthy. In fact, in my lifetime, we have seen tremendous cleanups. For example, rivers used to catch fire. They don't anymore. There is an obligation to human beings to provide for a clean environment. And that needs to be furthered and strengthened. Yes, but nature rights with everybody, 330 million people in America as potential putative plaintiffs enforcing their own view of what is right for nature, that just would lead to chaos.
Thank you, Wesley. We have 2 minutes, Thomas, for a reply.
Yeah, so sometimes when I run through the sad state of the environment in the US for various talks, somebody always puts up their hand and says, well, things aren't worse now than they were 40 years ago before the major environmental laws were passed because rivers don't catch on fire anymore. To which I say, well, if that's our metric, today, we're in real trouble. Rivers don't catch on fire anymore. Our right to clean water, even from a completely human anthropocentric perspective, is dependent on those waterways being clean. So everything's connected here. And waterways are not clean. So just to focus down on water and Florida for a moment, the existing environmental regime has given us 40% of waterways in the United States that aren't clean today, that don't even meet the minimum fishable, swimmable, drinkable standards that are set within the Clean Water Act. Something's not working. And they're not working because regulations can only go so far. We're all in favor of clean drinking water, but regulations themselves are constrained by this property rights system and a constitutional rights system which backs those property rights. So that when regulations go too far, it's called a regulatory takings under the law. And then the regulation is struck, or the government that has passed the regulation has to pay the property owner if they still want to enforce the regulation itself. We are in a world where those constitutional property rights trump almost everything else. And a lot of people are happy with that. It's kind of the human exceptional, human societies to thrive must be those protections for property, and property must trump those other rights. But what we're ending up in is a world where almost half our waterways are impaired or polluted, and we need a different system that actually supplants that. And in terms of more defenders rather than less, bring them on. The more lawyers, the better in this particular case, because if you want guardians for waterways, why have less rather than more? You want more people looking out for those interests, and the laws themselves define who can, because the standards that are set are not standards that a land developer is going to come in and bring a lawsuit over. It's the protective mechanism for environmental groups mostly who are protecting that particular ecosystem.
Wesley, you have up to a minute for final rebuttal.
I'm not that pessimistic. I believe that that we can and should continue to move forward to have a cleaner environment. When I grew up, things were a lot worse than they are now. I grew up in Los Angeles. The San Gabriel Mountains were 20 miles from my home. In the summer, you couldn't even see them because of the smog. That's not true anymore. And how did that get fixed? It got fixed. There's still smog in Los Angeles, but it got fixed because they put in a regulation. You have to have unleaded gasoline. So there are ways to do this. And I'm not so pessimistic that I think the world is ending and we're in a catastrophe. And sometimes I think Thomas reminds me of the religious fanatic holding up the sign, the end is nigh, the end is nigh. And I don't think that's true. And I believe that technology and education and innovation by human beings can solve the problems that we do have.
You were right on time, and I missed your cue. Sorry about that. We're a little bit ahead of time, and if it's okay with you, I'd like to exercise moderator's prerogative just to repeat the original question, because I feel like, as it happens sometimes through no fault of anyone's, that we've drifted just a little bit from the original question number 2. Do rights of nature laws affect human rights? And I just want to give you each another minute, starting with Wesley, and then letting starting with Thomas, and then Wesley conclude on this if we could. Thomas, do rights of nature laws affect human rights, and is that harmful to the protection of human rights? So if you could really focus on that formulation of the question, if you could, and then I'll let Wesley have a minute as well.
Yeah, I think they actually augment or enforce human rights. So you can't have rights if you're suffering from health impacts or don't have clean water. Those types of problems interfere with your human rights. We're going to talk about climate next and what's happening in the climate field about a right to climate. But I think the rights of nature field actually is augments or strengthens those human rights. The problem becomes is when we talk about property rights as being human rights. That's where the problem occurs, because property rights in the United States, it basically comes in the form of a bundle of sticks. When you own a piece of land, for example, you have a bundle of sticks or a bundle of rights, and one of those rights is to destroy the land that you own. So inevitably, when you have a wetland given a right to exist or recognized a right to exist, it changes the bundle of rights that we have as property. And that's a necessary thing, because otherwise those property rights would override any of these attempts at doing environmental protection efforts in this field. So from a human rights perspective, it's an augmenter. From a property rights perspective, it actually does remove some of those property rights protections as a necessary structural change.
So Wesley, is natural rights of nature harmful to the protection of human rights?
Right, because as I said, it turns the whole concept of rights into something that is so ever omnipresent that it no longer has the sense of urgency and importance in terms of principle. It's like, as I said, a wild inflation, what it does to currency. I would also point out that the countries that are the dirtiest in this world are those that are Marxist or are communist or are socialist, in the sense of China and places of that sort. You go and you need prosperity to have rights, because otherwise, if people are in a survival kind of mode, they're not going to be supporting environmentalism. I've been to some of the poorest countries in this world, and they have terrible environmental circumstances, and that's because they've not been able to develop their properties. They've not been able to develop their resources, and human rights in those places are almost non-existent.
Thank you for humoring me both. I think we're ready to move on to our third question, and this starts with Thomas. Thomas, given the crisis situation of climate change, do rights of nature laws have a role to play in these larger environmental problems? If yes, how? If no, why not? You have up to 3 minutes.
Thanks, Brian. So in 2016, Judge Ann Aiken of the Oregon Federal District Court, in a case dealing with young people suing the US government over climate inaction, known as the Juliana case, recognized that there's a human right to a livable, healthy climate in the US Constitution. That's a fundamental constitutional human right. And I think a lot of people embrace that, rightfully so, a human right found within the US Constitution to a livable, healthy climate. The question that we started to ask was, could the atmosphere have a right to a healthy climate? So along these rights of nature lines. And a couple other questions as well. Why are we relying on primary CO2 emitters in the world to voluntarily reduce their own emissions? It's like listening to Greta Thunberg the other day when she said, blah, 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 blah is the only thing that happens at these climate change meetings like COP26 in Scotland coming up. And the other question we asked is, what could be the role of rights of nature laws and rights-based litigation in stopping or slowing down climate change? So we launched a project with the government of the Maldives, which is an island nation off the coast of India. They were the folks that had that underwater cabinet meeting back in 2009. What it would look like to create a domestic right to a healthy climate, not just to a healthy climate, but right of the atmosphere of the climate itself. And then embed that right within the constitution for the country or a statute, which would enable them to then begin to prosecute some of the globe's largest CO2 emitters in their own domestic courts. For the life of me, I can't understand why this isn't happening now. Why is it a kumbaya moment when small island nations are disappearing beneath the waves, but nobody seems to be willing to turn the lawyers loose and treat it as a violation of rights of, in this case, small island nations, and of course, everywhere else impacted by global climate change. There was a coup in the Maldives, political coup, which headed off that project that we were working on. But the folks in Lafayette, Colorado picked it back up in 2017. They're near Boulder. Plans to frack the community, hydrofrack for natural gas, and there was a large movement to oppose fracking there. We helped them pass a law that recognized that ecosystems within the community had a right to a healthy climate. So not just people having a right to a healthy climate, but ecosystems having a right to a livable, healthy climate. And just from a layperson's perspective, it makes perfect sense. You can't have due process or equal protection rights or any of the other constitutional rights unless you're able to survive on the planet in a healthy, livable climate. Australia and Nepal, we've had projects over the years assisting folks in Australia to write and introduce a Great Barrier Reef Bill of Rights, which recognize the Great Barrier Reef as having a right to climate, right to a healthy, livable climate. The Himalaya Bill of Rights in Nepal that we helped to draft would recognize the Himalaya, the mountain chain, as having a right to climate, right to a healthy, livable climate. So I think that we're only limited here on climate issues or these other big issues facing us to creative approaches, willing communities who are willing to step outside the box, and enterprising lawyers who are willing to take it on.
Wesley, 2 minutes.
Thank you. You also believe in rights for the moon. So I've come to conclude that there is no natural aspect of the universe that you don't think should have rights. And considering that you want to support, and the nature rights movement wants to use the approach to fight climate change, that means there are now 7 billion individual plaintiffs, potential plaintiffs, each having their own vision of what would be an appropriate approach for managing nature. There's another 800-pound gorilla here that I have to chuckle about, because the worst polluter in the world is the communist Chinese government, CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. It's a terrible tyranny. It commits genocide against the Uyghurs. It live organ harvests Falun Gong political prisoners. It is engaged in terrible cultural genocide in Tibet. It has squashed Hong Kong freedom. It is the dirtiest ecosystem and environment that I've ever experienced. I spent 2 weeks in China and I was coughing up coal soot for weeks. My wife lost her voice. It was so bad. And they have no rule of law. I don't know how you think you're going to have people sue communist China, which is pouring out and belching out coal fumes, and expect that country, which is a tyranny, and of course it's not the people of China, it's the Communist Party of China, expect them to respond and react and say, oh, let's go to court and let's see what a jury has to say. It's incredibly naive. And it just means that the focus will be on stomping and suppressing Western economy, because that's what would happen, while China would then become the dominant country in the world.
Your timing is so good, Wesley. You're like spot on there, man. That's very good. Thank you for that. Thomas, up to a minute for rebuttal.
Yeah, so I recently had the opportunity to travel to Alaska and was surprised to learn that they had the most Superfund sites of any state in the United States. We've done a terrific job in the US through a capitalist economic system. And it really doesn't matter which kind of system you have. It's all about this dominant subordinate relationship to the natural environment. And I think that's shown kind of the most when Wesley uses the words like managing nature, that our job is to manage nature. That's kind of an 1800s concept of needing to manage nature. You still find it in the forestry department in the United States and other places, but that it's man's job to manage nature. That's kind of how this constitutional structure has produced that kind of language. And I also say one of the reasons why we don't have some wide-scale pollution problems is because we offshore it all. We send giant loads of garbage and toxics to other countries to process them there. So as one of the leading economies in the world and a country most responsible for CO2 emissions, I think in the US, this new approach is actually absolutely necessary to reverse the decline that we've had.
All right, so here we are on our fourth question. We're doing really well with time, and so there is a good chance that we'll be able to turn to audience questions. So if you have a question that you could formulate to the speakers in a way that I could ask it of both of them, that would be ideal. So feel free to use the Q&A feature to pose a question that you'd like me to consider for that next phase after this final fourth question we have, which I believe goes to you, Wesley. Given the prevalence of environmental problems as the human population grows and ecosystems continue to be placed under pressure, how, in your view, can we deal with those issues?
I think we have to deal with those issues through democratic processes, by electing people to office who will take these issues seriously. Regulation, and there is a problem. I've written books with Ralph Nader, and I know about the revolving door problem with regulation, but regulation can also be quite robust, and in many cases has been. I've already described the circumstance of when I grew up. how Los Angeles's air was improved tremendously through this system. The Endangered Species Act is another example. There was a time when bald eagles, just as an example, were on the way out. And birds were in terrible trouble because of the use of DDT. Why was DDT used? Was it designed to horribly despoil the environment? No, people were trying to stop malaria and things of that sort. And actually, malaria was wiped out in this country where it used to cause real trouble in the South and the East. But when we found out what DDT does, regulation stopped the use of DDT. The bald eagles are no more endangered, and they're coming back, and we've had a great resurgence in that regard. We also can look at the national parks. What a tremendous success the national parks have been, and what a tremendous example to the world. But if you had rights of nature, I'm not sure you'd be able to go into Yosemite and enjoy the beauties of Yosemite. You wouldn't be able to go into Yellowstone because human beings do impact those places. And the point of the national parks is to make sure that those places remain for our enjoyment and the beauty and the protection of the animals there and the environments there, but at the same time get human use. The thing I'm noticing in this discussion is the incredible romanticism of the idea that we can have 7 billion people live as Native Americans have with far fewer people. There are billions of mouths to feed. You have to deal with the reality that exists. We cannot live as hunter-gatherers. We cannot live as small farmers. We have to have industrialization. Right now in this country, there is a tremendous crisis brewing because of a supply chain issue. Gas prices are going up. There are shortages beginning to develop. This is precisely the kind of consequence that will occur if nature rights laws take effect. So there is a dynamic tension. There is a weighing and balancing that has to be done when dealing with the environment. You have to look at the human benefit, and you also have to look at the impact on the environment, and you have to do your best to provide for both.
Thank you. Thomas, reply for up to 2 minutes.
Yeah, being in the midst of the 6th great extinction, as a lot of scientists have called this, not my idea of a romantic evening, being in the middle of that extinction. I worked in the Pennsylvania Capitol for a number of years with the legislature, and I watched as the agribusiness lobbyists and agribusiness industry wrote the laws and the regulations that they handed off to the Senate or House Ag Committee. To call it a democratic process, especially around the permit and permit appeal stuff and regulations, it's kind of a farce. There's no democratic process operating in those hallways or in those rooms. What we have is a corporate run regulatory environmental process. And to think that we're going to make any change in that department by electing 1 or 2 good people, especially when the campaign finance laws have had such a grip over the election process and corporations can inject money willy-nilly, is kind of just naive. To think that we can actually obtain the kind of environmental protections that we need through that process, just not going to happen. And so firsthand, that was my realization and recognition in working in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, with the legislature and watching how that happened. The move to phase out DDT took 40 years. 40 years from the first established connections between DDT and human health and the actual phasing out. Leaded gasoline took 60 years. 60 years from the first scientific connections between leaded gasoline and lead in people's bloodstream to actually phase leaded gasoline out. I'm not going to hold my breath in a time when the planet is cooking itself and we have a very small window to actually change things around, to wait somehow for the magic genie to come out and make those kinds of changes in a shorter amount of time. Shoot, in the United States, it took women 120 years to even gain the right to vote. 120 years from the first organized conference around suffrage issues. The US Constitution makes it very difficult to change the source code or the DNA in this country. And so, rights of nature is kind of a shock to that system, but it's a necessary one.
Well, I find that quite amusing. You couldn't have held your breath in Los Angeles when I was a kid. Let's talk about one of the interesting things about the rights of nature. Santa Monica has declared the rights of nature. That's one of the ordinances. I grew up in Los Angeles, like I said. I know Santa Monica like the back of my hand. There's no nature left in Santa Monica. So why would Santa Monica declare the rights of nature? It's an ideological statement. It's an ideological statement that human beings are just another animal in the forest, and that we should, and that way we should, if we think of ourselves that way, we will be more gentle on the land and so forth. But I think the opposite is true. If we think of ourselves as just another animal in the forest, if we don't see ourselves as having unique duties, which comes specifically from being human, that's how we'll act. We'll act like animals in the forest. This is not the right approach. If we don't have a good environment in a free society, we have the right to make a difference. But if you go into nature rights and you go into water rights, you will interfere with so much enterprise that the economy will collapse, and then the people will reject environmentalism because they want to have survival and prosperity too. And it's bad for environmentalism to not have a good and healthy economy.
All right, so now we're going to have an opportunity, because we are doing well with time, to turn to a question posed by the audience. And so this is the question, I believe, that our rotation has us for the fifth question, going first to Thomas. Thomas, is there a healthy compromise to be had between the two positions that we've heard tonight? For example, several states have a constitutional right to a healthy environment, as opposed to rights of nature. And there was an effort to amend the US Constitution to include such a right, namely, quote, the right of each person to clean and healthy air and water. So I think the idea that this person is proposing is that enshrining people's right to a healthy environment, could that be a middle position between the rights of nature position and the no rights of nature position? And why don't you start 3 minutes, and then we'll go to Wesley.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we're going to talk about Wesley's favorite topic, which is Florida, and the laws that are being put forward there. It's interesting to note that the Florida folks, headed by a group called the Florida Rights of Nature Network, who are advancing rights of nature laws across the state of Florida, and some of their work resulted in the Orange County law. That the Orange County law that we've been talking about tonight, this county of 1.5 million people, actually does both. It has a right of people to clean water, so a right of Orange County residents to clean water. And then it also recognizes the Wekiva and Econ-Lockhatchee rivers and other waterways, other waters in Orange County, as having certain rights of their own. So this connectedness that the questioner asks about, it's not so much about negotiating middle ground as doing both, understanding that we people are part of this natural system. But as part of the natural system, if the natural system doesn't have rights, i.e. the most highest level of environmental protections that Western law affords, that we won't be able to achieve our right to clean water. And so Orange County is a really good example. The other great example is the Florida Rights of Nature Network, and now folks are working to amend the Florida Constitution with the same kind of two-shot shuffle, which is one, to recognize in law Floridians' right to clean water as a human right, but also the rights of waterways and iconic animal species like the panther and the manatee within Florida as having rights of their own, understanding again that these rights are connected between the two. The questioner also asked about these state constitutional amendments, and indeed there are. In Minnesota, there's a Minnesota Environmental Rights Act, which is a statute. And in Pennsylvania, Article 1, Section 27 of the Pennsylvania Constitution, and also Montana has a constitutional provision that recognizes a right to a healthy environment. The problem is that in the early days, in the 70s and 80s, when courts began to actually examine and interpret, especially Pennsylvania's law, they held that it wasn't self-executing, i.e. that individual people couldn't bring it as a claim, that it just told the Department of Environmental Protection and other regulatory agencies what kind of authority they had to implement permitting programs. So it fell short. And that was the case up until recently, when courts began to reinterpret those constitutional amendments to actually provide some of the protections that they were originally supposed to provide. So unfortunately, that right to a right to a healthy environment, right to a livable, clean environment, has fallen short as a human right, also because courts look to you as to whether you have standing to be in court or not to even enforce the thing. And most of the times that comes down to a very narrow group of people who either have property rights that are afflicted or damaged by the project that's under consideration, or some other kind of rights within this constitutional property context under which they can bring a lawsuit. The rights of nature laws are intended to remedy that by allowing people to stand in the shoes of an ecosystem to bring a lawsuit based on the rights in the law.
The rights of nature are intended to make the most radical environmental ideologues the ones who get to drive policy. And that's why they would be the ones who would actually be suing. I actually think the question raises a very good point, and it eradicates some of my objections in the sense of it would be people-oriented, human-oriented, and it would be about human rights. And if a human being can show they've been harmed by not having clean water, for example, it seems to me they would have standing. And with regard to the issue of interpretation, it's going to take decades if you have a true nature rights regimen go into place for courts to work out how that would work. And note there's no human need in part of these laws. So what would be the human aspect of this? It could be that the rights of nature would supplant the needs of human beings. And again, let's go back to that Florida proposal for a constitutional amendment. I'll read it again. Florida waters, and that's all waters, have a right to clean water. The right shall include the right of those waters to exist, flow, be free from pollution, and maintain a healthy ecosystem. Also, not only would these rights of water extend beyond keeping water clean, it could prevent people from managing waterways or using waterways altogether. For example, the right to exist would, among many other likely scenarios, prohibit swamps from being drained. And because it would be a right, as opposed to being the subject of a reasonable regulation, swamp draining could become prohibited regardless of the human benefit or productive purpose. Water would also have the right to flow. That would seem to prohibit any damming, flood control projects, and diversions of natural waterways, because there is no wording about the human need and the human benefit. And if you have don't have grandfather clauses, and the Colorado River gets the right to flow, goodbye Hoover Dam. And if you don't have Hoover Dam, goodbye all that electricity that's generated without using coal, natural gas, or any other fossil fuel.
Thomas, 1 minute.
Yeah, I would note that language in the constitutional amendment that Wesley quoted was adopted by 89% of the voters in Orange County, Florida, when they adopted their county law. So imagine 89%. Initiatives don't get 89%. It's rare that they get 51%, but 89% of folks in Orange County. And we also have to keep in mind that in Florida, 9 million acres of wetlands have been extinguished. 9 million acres of wetlands in Florida have disappeared because of the existing environmental regulatory system. And, the use of the word radical, we used to call the abolitionists radical and the suffragists radical. Their ideas were radical. Eventually they come into the mainstream. And the final thing I say is, hey, under existing laws, say bye-bye to the Colorado River as well. Under existing laws, because the Colorado River doesn't even finish its course at this point. It dries up before it gets there, and now states are arguing over using more. So bye-bye Colorado River under existing law. Doesn't take a rights of nature law to somehow lead to that outcome. But today, under existing laws, we can say goodbye to the Colorado River.
All right, so what I'd like to propose is sort of, we've got questions in the Q&A that are to one of you and not the other. So I'd like to maybe see if we could, because it looks like we're doing okay with the time, is to pose a question to one of you and then give you a minute to answer with maybe 30 seconds for, well, no, let's just leave it at that, a minute to sort of respond. And then I'll go to the other person with a separate question and then give them a minute to respond. Does that sound okay?
Sure.
So Wesley, the questioner asks, do you believe existing environmental regulations are sufficient to safeguard wildlife and the environment?
It would depend on the regulation. Some, yes. I think the Endangered Species Act, for example, has worked very well and brilliantly. It has brought many species back from near extinction, and I certainly would support that law. There are also other gradations in terms of protecting wildlife. So yeah, I think some do, and I think some don't. And I think you have to look at them piece by piece. The thing that strikes me is I was once in trial court, and I was a young lawyer, and I was kind of struggling in a cross-examination. And the judge lowered his glasses and looked at me, and he said, "Mr. Smith, please use a rifle instead of a shotgun." That's the problem with this proposal. It's a shotgun. It scatters everywhere. It doesn't focus. It doesn't deal with the issues that where there are a problem. It cuts across the board. And the unintended consequences of allowing everyone to sue for nature's rights is going to end up, again, not with just Thomas being able to bring these cases, but people that Thomas might disagree with, for example, people who oppose the windmills that are killing the birds.
So the question for you, Thomas, is the following. Do you believe additional protection can be obtained simply by stronger enforcement of existing environmental laws and regulations? Why or why not?
Well, no, which is why the rights of nature field has actually grown. But just to comment on some of what Wesley said previously as well, which I think connects with this issue, is that environmental regulations today are basically used to legalize certain harms. We don't look at them that way. We usually look at environmental regulations as protective things, but they actually legalize harms. There's even something in the law called a permit shield defense, which I ran up against as a young lawyer, in which a company operating with a permit has a legal shield against liability for activities taken under that permit. So it's a governmental legalization of something that would probably be illegal under the law in terms of a discharge to a river or some other kind of pollution. So it's important to understand, I think, that environmental regulations, even though we don't see them that way sometimes, actually authorize environmental harm. And in fact, the Department of Interior just released a list of species that weren't protected by the Endangered Species Act and are now extinct in the US. So the Endangered Species Act recognizes a species as having rights, but only when there's only one left or several left, small population. But also there's a problem with critical habitat, which is that the law doesn't always protect the habitat necessary for the actual continued existence of the species, mostly because of property rights limitations.
You've been very accommodating of my sort of trying to fit in some of these questions. I think, though, we're in good position now to move to closing statements. As we agreed, we'll begin with Wesley. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. And thank you, Thomas, for a very good exchange. It's nice to see you at last and to hear what you have to say. And I certainly accept and appreciate the sincerity of your approach and your desire to help the environment. But the part that I think is missing here is what will be the impact on human society? What will be the impact on poor people in cities? What will be the impact on people around the world? For example, one of the things that is, I think, most urgently needed to help destitute people in Africa would be a continent-wide electrical grid that would allow for clean water, would allow for hospitals. But you can't do that without using current technologies. And so a nature rights approach would keep those people mired in destitution. And in many ways, that's why I think nature rights is not intentionally perhaps, but I think it's distinctly anti-human because it would have a terrible impact on most people. It would reduce economies and it would prevent emerging countries and developing countries from being able to develop into a full, robust human societies that have prosperity and can enjoy the best of life. Nature rights is the wrong policy to improve our environment and protect human thriving. You have to have both. And on Thomas's side, I only mostly hear the idea of, we could lose wetlands. Well, what were those wetlands used for? What was the human benefit that attained? These are things that have to be asked and dealt with each case. Which brings us to the core reasons why granting rights to nature would be subversive to Western values, but highly destructive to human thriving. It violates human exceptionalism, as we've discussed. To put it more colloquially, nature rights ideology seeks to demote us from the exceptional species with duties. We're the only species that have duties to just another animal in the forest. It devalues the vibrancy of rights. Granting rights to nature means that everything is a potential rights bearer. If everything has rights, including the moon, one could say nothing does. At best, nature rights would devalue the concept in such a way that, as I said repeatedly, and I won't say it again, yes, I will, how inflation destroys currency. Indeed, if a squirrel or a mushroom and all other earthly entities somehow possess rights, the vibrancy of rights withers. Nature rights would cause profound harm to human thriving in that sense. Granting rights to nature would bring economic growth to a screeching halt by empowering the most committed and radical environmentalists granted legal standing to sue on nature's behalf. It would take environmental policy out of the democratic deliberation policy and put it to judges, which I wouldn't trust judges myself, because I don't think that's what what freedom in the West is about. It's not about judges deciding. It's about people in democratic societies deciding. Normal environmental laws allow the natural world to be harnessed for human benefit, mediated by our responsibilities to engage in proper environmental policies. Granting rights to nature would shatter this nuanced approach, and we've been through that. Nature rights is unnecessary, I don't believe, and we've been through that, for proper environmental protection. And again, there'd be no limitations. You add in global warming and climate change, and there would be no human endeavor that would be free from challenge. Nature rights would destroy prosperity, and it would privatize public policy through the use of the civil justice system. And if it can, as I said, if it can be done for nature rights, now it's being done for abortion. If you're in for one, you're going to have to be in for another. Pretty soon it'll be done for biomedical technologies and biomedical research, perhaps gun control. And eventually we'll just have a situation where everybody's suing everybody over their own personal interests and policy agendas. It would create an economic calamity, as private enterprise would be unable to stop or develop in the natural world. And of course, once again, I want to bring up China. China is a tyranny. The People's Republic of China, the Communist Party of China, will pay no attention to these things. They do not allow rule of law. They do not allow courts to come in. Thomas would not be welcome to go there and argue a case and have Xi Jinping say, oh my gosh, the rights of nature, we've got to do away with our coal plants. Not going to happen. So you're going to end up in a situation, if the West decides to go this route and suppresses our economy, because that's the only way to attain the desired results that the nature rights movement is after. China will just dominate this world. And that would be a catastrophe for everybody. Freedom is what matters. Prosperity matters, and the environment matters. We can have all three if we work in a dynamic tension through democratic processes. And thank you, Dr. Henning, for this opportunity. I really appreciated it. And I was noticing some of the comments being made, and I appreciate some of those too, even the ones that have told me to, jump in the lake. So thanks very much.
So far the chat's been, people are trying to be respectful down there. We're so far so good. Thank you for that, Wesley. And your closing statement, Thomas.
Yeah, again, a big thank you to Wesley for being a debater tonight. And thanks again to the Center for Climate Society and the Environment, and Dr. Henning, your leadership of the center, and all the work and programming that you guys do. I think we're in the middle of a revolution of sorts. It's a birth. We're seeing a birth. And that birth is really to bring ourselves into alignment with the needs of the place where we live, this small blue marble. Going back to something that was said earlier, I happen to think the earth is a better place because pollywogs live here. I do. I think it's a better place, but I also think humanity's future depends on our ability to protect those pollywogs in a better way. The current system of law is kind of akin to denying that gravity exists. We have a system of law that pretends that our survival is not dependent on the earth. It's not dependent upon these life support systems. And they say that large crises call for structural changes, big scale structural changes. And I think the rights of nature is emerging as that practical shift in the structure. Whether it's in 2006 to deal with toxic waste in a small Pennsylvania community, the 36 tribal and municipal communities in the US that have passed rights of nature laws to protect salmon, rivers, and other ecosystems, the Ecuadorians who have moved to protect their biodiversity, the high courts of 4 countries that have moved to protect rivers using rights of nature concepts, and these enforcement cases now in US and tribal courts. They're aligning our system of law to understand that our survival is dependent and contingent on the Earth's flourishing, not just for our life support systems, but also because it's morally and ethically correct. And I think deep down that human exceptionalism isn't the solution. It's actually the problem itself. It's the problem that evidences itself with the Catholic Church in the 1600s when they sought to punish Galileo for arguing that the Earth actually moved around the sun rather than the other way around. I think rights of nature activists find themselves whispering the same thing that Galileo did, which is, and yet it moves in this system of property rights heavy stuff that crowds out the ability for anything else to survive. The problem is we have a colonist mentality that we're separate from the Earth, that mankind, humans are separate, but somehow dominant of everything. Our language even our language has been colonized. We use the word undeveloped to describe a piece of land that doesn't have a structure on it, that man has put there. Yet that land has been developed over millions of years from an ecological perspective. The ecology there and the environment is very developed, but it's kind of crowded into even our language. And this concept that endless economic growth is possible, that we have to destroy the environment to have a clean environment, that we have to exploit the environment to then have environmental protection is not the way that this place is going to survive. Rights of nature is actually pro-human. It's guaranteeing clean air to breathe, guaranteeing clean water to drink. If no humans are left, it doesn't matter what rights we have. It doesn't matter what property rights we have. It just doesn't matter because we're not here. The default is for this system to actually become the default system of what we so desperately need here is to move upwards into state constitutions, which the folks in Florida are working on now, to recognize rights for waterways and iconic species like the panther and manatee, which are at risk of extinction. But we also need to think higher. And at the risk of exploding Wesley's brain, we're talking about changing the US Constitution, the DNA or the source code of what exists here. We have a 1780s plan of governance. It's almost like we're still running off Microsoft Word 1.0. It needs an upgrade. The founding fathers didn't know anything about acidification of the oceans or climate change or the massive environmental problems that we now face around the globe. We need to change the source code. And I think one piece of changing the source code is recognizing these legally enforceable rights of nature. It's not everything, but it's a big piece of the paradigm shift that has to take place to incorporate these indigenous wisdom, indigenous cultural values into this Western system of law, which is kind of like a suicide pact at this point, based on these property rights and this dominant subordinate relationship that we have with nature. I think Derek Jensen said it best. He's a well-known author, wrote an article called Beyond Hope, and this is what Derek had to say. He said, quote, "If we wish to stop the atrocities, we need merely to step away from the isolation. There is a whole world waiting for us, ready to welcome us home."
Thank you both. Let's all please thank Wesley Smith and Thomas Linzey for being here this evening and debating this interesting emerging idea of rights of nature. I found it really instructive, and I look forward to playing this for my students, and I imagine that many people around the world will be watching it in the days to come. I also want to thank my colleague Laurel Burlingame for her wonderful assistance in running this event this evening.
And of course, all of you point
at
of
home.
personal privilege, just real quick question for Thomas. Is that allowed?
Sure, Wesley. What do you have in mind?
I would like him to address the China question. He's avoided it twice.
Yeah.
Well, so it kind of opens up a Pandora's box in a way, Wesley, because
next time
we've got quite a few questions in the
time.
chat about confusions about why it's being brought up. I don't know if we can do it concisely. So unfortunately,
we'll do another debate, Wesley.
There you go. That's a great answer. The center would be very happy to have you back because this was a lot of fun. And we have recorded it. It will be available on our YouTube channel as soon as we can get it up there. If you look in the chat, we've posted the URL where you can get a link to that YouTube channel. And if you subscribe to the channel, you'll be notified when the videos are posted, which is always a good idea. To conclude, I also wanted to let you know that we are hosting several additional events coming up this semester and early next. On November 3rd, Dr. Mary Evelyn Tucker from Yale University will be talking about Thomas Berry's vision for the Earth community. On November 16th, we'll be hosting on campus Dr. Bob Lutz, our former health officer, and Amber Lenhart to talk about climate crisis as public health crisis. And then next February, we'll be hosting a virtual event that's free and open to the public with the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer. And so I encourage everyone who's interested to consider registering for those events. We would love to see you at an event in the future. You can find us online at Gonzaga Climate. Thank you all again for joining us, and have a wonderful night.